Welcome to Financial Revelations. I am David Safransky, your host, and you can reach us at FI Revelations on Twitter, FI Revelations on Twitter, and you can always email Joshua at epsf.com, Joshua at epsf.com, and both of those addresses will be on the screen, so you don't have to remember them. You can write them down as they come up. If you're watching, of course, if you're not watching and you're listening, it's on you. So, hey, last week I said that there was one thing that would change my investment thesis if it were to happen. And that one thing could change everything. So, what are those everythings? It's how I would construct a portfolio, how I'm thinking long term. It would affect oil prices. Inflation, already high inflation, the Fed, stocks, basically everything investment related, it would change. And I said that I would tell you what that one thing is today. And I'm going to do that. But first, I want to give you a little update on what's going on economically if you haven't been paying attention. And, I never mind when people don't pay attention because you have your life to live. You're working and raising a family probably, or you got kids living in other cities and you're going to see grandkids. So I understand that people are busy. It's the exact reason why I don't fix my transmission when it's broke. I don't have the time for that. I pay somebody to do that stuff. I can't be an expert in everything, and fixing a transmission is a little bit technical, I would imagine, and it's heavy. You got to have special tools for that. That's what I represent. I'm like your transmission guy for your finances, okay? And that's what financial people do. Certainly, we're not the only people who do this. You could go to a lot of different sources and get good information. And I would suggest that you do that. I would suggest that you cross-reference the things that we say here with other people. Get informed, stay informed as much as you can, and then find somebody that you can trust and do exactly that. Trust them. So here's the update. I have written down, but first, an update. The Fed is probably going to raise next meeting, which is in May, by 0.5 point. The reason I believe that is because, one, they're out saying it quite a bit. There's several Fed presidents, and if you don't know this, the Federal Reserve is 12 private banks around the country that control the money supply. That's what they do. The Fed governors are appointed. They're selected by the president, appointed by the Senate, voted on by the Senate. They serve terms. Not all of them vote at the same time. There's a cycle that they vote, and then they're off the voting committee for a while, and then they're back on. So not all Fed governors vote, but even the ones who don't vote are out in the press talking about it being totally appropriate to go 0.5 point. And unfortunately, I think they're right because inflation numbers are really high. We don't even have the inflation numbers yet from when the war in Ukraine started in earnest and oil prices skyrocketed. We're going to get those next week. I think it's going to be above 10%, and that's going to look really bad to the market. And so I think the Fed is going to go 0.5 point next meeting. Now, what does that mean to the average person like us? One, it means if you're out getting a mortgage and you haven't locked your rate, it's going up by at least 0.5 point. And what happens is if you're the way people buy houses, they tend to buy to their limit. It's like when you buy a car, you're really buying a payment for most people. Our people don't do that because we're thinking a little bit ahead of that. But when people buy a house, they're going to buy to their limit. So if they're looking at houses, they finally find one, they love it, they're going to go buy it, and all of a sudden they've been priced out of the market because their mortgage is 0.5 point higher, you're going to see the housing market slow down. If you run a balance on credit cards, which you should never do, don't ever run a balance on credit cards. And I know that sounds easy in theory, but in practice, I understand that there are times you have to run a balance. But the idea behind a credit card, at least my idea, and I learned this from my wife, LaVon, she's always been extremely smart, detailed, attentive to our personal finances. She manages our budget at home and our finances. and she's been great at it our whole married life. And when we first got married, I had a credit card and I was going to run a balance on it. And she looked at me like my dogs look at me when they're confused. I've said a word that they don't understand. Kind of her head went sideways, and she squinted at me. She said, "We don't run balances on credit cards." And she learned that from Larry Burkett. And we have done that our entire marriage. We've never run a balance on a credit card. We have limited any interest we've ever paid to a credit card. We're the credit card's worst customer. Now, they do make money on us because they charge the merchants a little extra for that transaction. But that's what you should be doing with your credit cards. And the first time you run a balance on a credit card, alarm bells should be going off in your head. Something's wrong. You're buying things you can't afford, you can't pay for. Stop using that credit card until the balance is paid off, and you will never get into trouble with credit cards. When people come to my office and they're in financial difficulty, that's usually the reason. They got behind on credit card payments. They're getting 0% from this one to that one to this one to that one, so they start playing the game, and then something happens where they can't play the game anymore. And those 0% credit cards, they're not going to be around in a Fed tightening cycle, and that's what's happening. I do think also that we're probably going to go into a mild recession probably around the second quarter, somewhere right around the election. It's just the timing that I'm seeing right now, because the Fed is going to have the rate hike in May, June, July, and I think that's going to push us into a very mild recession. Now, it doesn't mean that the stock market is going to go to zero or anything, but it does become a little bit more difficult to make money in the market. And so what I want to own are things that make money. Big stocks, cash flow positive, dividend paying, the big companies. So if, when people are buying houses, Home Depot and Lowe's do really well because everybody's fixing up their new house. When people aren't buying houses, Home Depot and Lowe's does really well because people are now staying and they're fixing up the house the way they want it, because it's really tough to get somebody to go from a 2% mortgage to a 5.5% mortgage. They just don't want to do it. So I do think we're going to go into a mild recession somewhere around the election. And I think the Fed is embarking now on a 2 to 3 year tightening cycle. And what that means is that at most of their meetings, until inflation is back down around 4%, I think that they're going to be tightening. And that could go 2 or 3 years. Now, a lot of people think, fuel is going to come down in price, but it's not going to come down in price. In fact, it's going to go higher. And the reason is because the administration really they're executing a war on fossil fuels that started on day 2 after they took office, and that is not changing. It's not going to change until you have a different party in the White House, which I think will be next election, but that's 3 years away. So we've got a ways to go of higher gas prices, and if the Fed doesn't get this under control, I think you could see easily $6 a gallon gas in Ohio. That means you'd probably see $8 a gallon gas in California. That's expensive gas, no matter how you slice it. So now, back to what I told you I said I was going to do. I have my owl with me today. It scares the birds away from my windows. It was a gift to me like 20 years ago from a client. I still have it. I don't know why I kept it. But what I said I would do last week, and I'm going to give you that one thing, and that one thing is in November, we have the midterm elections, and a lot is at stake here. I don't know if it's the most important election we've ever had, but it is important. All elections are important these days. And in November, the one thing that could happen that would change my investment thesis, how I look at portfolios, how I'm thinking long term, oil prices, inflation, the Fed, stocks, basically everything, is if the Democrats were to keep the House and the Senate, it would be seen as nothing less than a political mandate, and they would take this to the bank, basically your bank, and take your money, because gas will definitely be $6, $7 a gallon, because they're going to go all in New Green Deal. They're going to go all in against oil and fossil fuels. I've said it before. If you went back to 1970 and looked at the Paul Ehrlich, He's a renowned environmentalist. He's a voice of environmentalism. He's an advisor to the administration. He's a prestigious professor at Stanford University even now. In 1970, he predicted that if we stayed on our current course with fossil fuels, there would be immense destruction, loss of life. England would be underwater by 12 feet by the year 2000. All these bad things were going to happen. And essentially, what we did is we didn't stay on the same course of our fossil fuel use. We basically tripled it since 1970. And we have lived longer. We are richer. The air is cleaner. The water is cleaner. You don't ever hear about acid rain anymore. All of that's gone. We have cleaned up the environment while using 3 times as much fossil fuels. They have been wrong about not virtually everything. They have been wrong about everything. In essence, they are morons. And their goal isn't to better mankind. Their goal is to make nature as if we had never had an impact on it. And all they see from fossil fuels is the negatives. They never see the positives. If you look at the things that easy, inexpensive, and reliable energy do for societies, it's incalculable how much it has contributed to the value of human life, the length of our lives. Think about, I just read a story about a country called the Gambia, where they cannot do ultrasound tests because they don't have reliable power to do it. And because of that, they cannot diagnose problem pregnancies that would be easily solved here where we have that stuff. And consequently, their infant mortality rate is like 5 times higher than the United States because they don't have easy, cheap, reliable power. Their power goes out every day after 2 o'clock in the Gambia, every day. And sometimes it's not on before 2 o'clock, so they can't schedule a test for a pregnant woman. So I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here, but what is going to happen here is they're going to force battery and electric and wind power, which accounts for a whopping 3% of our current energy output. 3%. In Germany, there's days where wind and solar account for 40%, and there's other days where it accounts for 2% or even 0%. It's not reliable enough to have a modern society based off of that energy. Now, I think we should be exploring different kinds of power. There's nothing wrong with that. I like that. I like to have wind and solar as a supplement, and there are places on Earth where it could work. It's just not everywhere, and it's not going to be here. So we have to reject in wholesale their dumb ideas and vote against the Democrats in November. Now, if you're a Democrat, you're going to the pump right now, and you're seeing what's happening. Well, some of it is related to Ukraine and what's happening there. But if you remember, before Ukraine happened, gas was already double what it was 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 3 years ago. Double. And that's because that's a self-inflicted gunshot wound by the administration and their war on fossil fuels. We need fossil fuels. We should be using more fossil fuels. We should be clean about the environment, which we obviously are because the environment's way cleaner than 1970, way cleaner now than when we were using 2/3 less natural gas and oil, and wind and solar are 3% of our energy output. It's just not enough, and it's not reliable enough. If the Dems keep the House and the Senate, gas is going to be $6 a gallon. You would have heard it here first. I want you to remember that if you are paying $6 a gallon. Now, the only thing that I think could really get in the way of the Republicans taking over the House and the Senate, because admittedly, the Republicans are pretty good at snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory, is if COVID came back and we were mailing out ballots again. Because I do think, as a true-blooded, red-blooded American, I think it's good to go to the polls. I like to go to the polls. And as long as we can do it, I think we should go to the polls. Now, if somebody wants to request an absentee ballot, they have to request it. It could be mailed to them one at a time. We're not mailing out 350 million ballots to people. 100 million of those ballots, people aren't even alive. So as long as that doesn't happen, I think the Republicans will take the House and the Senate. We need the Senate by at least 4 votes because we have 2 senators who are kind of rhinos, and they'll give away the House for the right price. So that's the one thing that can change my entire investment thesis. So I need you to vote. I need you to go and vote. I need you to encourage your friends who think like us to vote. And we need to get rational about how we're going to deal with energy in this country, because right now it's killing us. And the administration's war on fossil fuels is really emboldening our enemies. It emboldened Russia. They were making $1 billion extra a day because of oil prices. This is before Ukraine. Saudi Arabia, not our friend, making billions of dollars a day. And then when Joe Biden went to them and asked them to pump more oil, they said, no, we're not going to help you. So it's time that we became energy independent again. We were 3 years ago. We were energy independent. We were shipping oil out. And now we're buying it again. And that puts us at risk and emboldens our enemies. And that's got to stop. So if the Dems keep the House and the Senate, got to rethink everything. If they don't, we got a chance. And that's what I want to focus on. I am David Safransky. This is Financial Revelations, and I'll talk to you next week.